Statistically, I read something the other day that said this has been one of the darkest winters on record in about 80 years, and I'm feeling it. I am ready for spring. Everything's melting around here, getting super muddy, but that's good. The ponds are opening up, ducks are back, so hopefully we're going to get to do a lot of shooting in the near future. But I wanted to make this video to show you guys what I've been up to gear-wise. Been talking to a lot of people about why I left the Fuji system, and ultimately the biggest reason was lens support. I wanted to dig into different lens options that I didn't have on crop sensors that are available on some of the full-frame systems, but especially some of these older Sigma lenses and other third-party things. It's interesting when you come to Nikon, you've got options like the 200 to 400 f4 VR2. Older lens, heavy, but pretty affordable. In Canada, I see them for sale routinely for about 3,000 Canadian used. So that's certainly not cheap, but I think the issue is when you're looking at these new mirrorless lenses and you're seeing, the new 400Z 2.8 from Nikon, which is obviously an amazing lens, but that thing's pushing $20,000 in Canada. Not in the cards for me, and for a lot of my viewers too, that's just not something that's possible. So today I want to show you the coolest thing that I have picked up for the Sigma kit, for the Nikon kit. It's really turning into the Sigma kit because all the lenses are Sigma. Stick around to the end of the video and I'll kind of show you guys what gear I was using to vlog for this, so an experiment here. So the point of this video today, what have I bought? Let's see if I can do this without hurting myself. This is too low to the ground. I thought I had the tripod better adjusted. So as I pop this back up, let me talk about what this thing is. This is the Sigma 800, which way are we going? The Sigma 800 5.6, what's the name? Let's see here. The EXDG 5.6 800 Hypersonic. So I did some research and this lens, it's a beast. This lens came out, I believe, in 2005. There were 3 versions of it. There are like no videos of it on the internet. I couldn't find anything. But my recent duck video, if you didn't see that from a couple of days ago, was shot exclusively using this. And I'm going to put some stills up here as well about what it is. So why am I using this thing? And I want to tell you guys about it. I recently saw one for sale locally for Canon. So they are out there. Now Sigma also made a 300 to 800 lens, and I think that came out after this, but actually I really can't say for sure. But they came out around the same time. They're both 20-ish years old. What are they? So as with most Sigma stuff, they're big, they're super heavy, but it's very sharp and performs really well. The autofocus works really well on this with the Z9. It's definitely way slower than other lenses I've used, but it works for what I want it for. This isn't a lens, it's way too heavy. Like I wouldn't use this handheld for anything, and I wouldn't use it for action photography. But I'm using it for video and for stills, especially things like ducks low to the ground. And presumably I'll shoot owls probably from the car with it, or even ospreys and stuff like that. I'm still on the fence whether or not it's going to make it into the kayak. The lens weighs, I want to say about 12 pounds. It's definitely over 10, and it's gigantic. Like you can see, the lens is wider than me when you've got the hood on. The hood, as with most of these things, pretty big. So the hood definitely saves a lot of space, but you've got, a dinner plate sized piece of glass here on the front that you need to protect. So, yeah, so shooting without the hood's not something that I do. But I think what's cool is if you're shooting primarily Canon or Nikon, then you have access to these old lenses. So, just talking about Sigma for a second, some cool lenses that you have the option. The 120 to 300 2.8, the 500 f4. So, again, these are Canadian prices, but I've seen the 120 to 300 for sale for about 2,500 Canadian, and I've seen the 500 f4 for sale for about 4,000, 4,500. You don't see a ton of them, but they do come up. The 800 here, I paid less than 2,000 Canadian for this, and I him and hawed about it for a week probably, and I expected someone would buy it. And the reason I didn't buy it is because it's heavy and unwieldy, and it's not practical. But, you know, when I switched over and I had to decide what gear to replace, something like this wasn't something I ever really thought about before. And it does a lot of cool things for me that other lenses don't do. So, I mean, the reach right away is handy on the full frame. So the Fuji kit was shooting 900 millimeters equivalent, but that was shooting that at f8 on an APS-C. So really that was equivalent to like, I don't know, f13 in terms of depth of field. So the first time I put this thing on, actually, as the first thing I put it on, I had a lot of issues with like heat distortion just from the huge hood and the winter and coming inside and outside. So I really struggled to get it to work initially. But once it was working, I took some pictures of squirrels, which I'll post up here, and I was just like stunned by the depth of field. And it's funny because you buy lenses like this in the old days for this sharpness bonus was what people thought about when they looked at big primes, and you definitely get a sharp lens, but I think like these modern mirrorless lenses are super, super sharp as well. So I don't think that's a huge benefit of these primes, but the look is what you're paying for. So if you're really craving something that can just obliterate backgrounds, even when the backgrounds are closer, and you know, even when, I'll try to compare a few shots here with the Fuji to this, and the Fuji, I've got my pond in my backyard, so I shot that lens a lot last summer when I got it, and it certainly blows out the background when there's separation. But I am noticing that this just does something way more. It makes everything a little bit more creamy. Do you need it? Yeah, definitely not. But I think if you're interested in stuff like this, and so put it this way, if you're interested in stuff like this and you're shooting a crop sensor from Fuji, it doesn't even exist. If you're shooting Sony, then you've got limited lens options and they're all new and expensive and you don't really see them used at all. If you're shooting Canon and Nikon, then you start to get into some of the older things that give you an option. So what are the drawbacks on these old lenses? Well, like I said, they're super heavy. This doesn't have image stabilization, so even if you were strong and you wanted to hand hold it, you're going to struggle there because there's no stabilization in it. So like the Canon 800 5.6 does, the Nikon does, but again, you're talking a used one of those is what, 10,000 probably minimum. So this is, you know, 5 times cheaper, and it's giving me a very comparable image, just without some of the utility. Now it's funny because shooting this lens has got my brain spinning that I'd really like to try the 800 6.3. Now I'd be curious to see how the different types of optics, what Nikon's done with the PF lenses to shave weight and save money. It'd be interesting to see what the look is. It's only a third of a stop slower, but I'd like to compare those. Certainly the weight benefits of the Nikon are awesome, but it does get me thinking if it's a lens I would buy, because the one thing for me about weight, and I've talked about this before, but I've got bad feet and knees, so I don't hike anyways, so I'm not carrying this through the mountains. I'm at most carrying it, you know, maybe a kilometer, usually way less than that, and then setting up shop. So if I'm doing any kind of, even if I was shooting the 800 6.3, certainly I could go shoot it handheld, but I'm doing a lot of video focused stuff. So even if I'm doing a lot of stills in the field, I'm probably going to want a tripod with me anyway. So when I'm ready to film, you know, I've got the iFootage fluid head here, and you know, being able to shoot ducks, like you can see how smooth this is. You know, just being able to move this around like that's not something that I could do handheld. So even if the lens only weighed 5 or 6 pounds instead of 10 or 12, I mean, I would certainly take it, but I feel like I'd have to carry the tripod anyway. So at that point, if I'm going to be shooting on a tripod, the weight of the lens doesn't really matter all that much. The solar autofocus is definitely something to think about. You know, it's not something you would buy as a I would never buy something like this for action. It's very difficult to frame things up at a full 800 millimeters from what I'm seeing. Even on the Fuji, when you were shooting at 900 millimeters, that was a zoom, so I would frequently zoom out if I lost my subject and zoom back in. So that's not something you can do here. Shooting ducks, like it was really tough. If I missed the duck and I moved a couple inches, all of a sudden I was focusing, you know, 500 meters past and had to try to really struggle to find them. Now that's a lot easier to do with the viewfinder when you can kind of match it up. But if you're shooting low and I have the tripod on the ground and I'm shooting off the screen, then it gets really difficult ergonomically to try to frame everything up. Which, if I bring this in the boat for loons, that'll be something that I end up doing. So we'll see how that's going to happen. This will never be the only lens I bring in the kayak, just in case I'm struggling with it. But it's something to check out, and I think this is a lens. I mean, if you can find a copy of this, there's no reviews anywhere really on YouTube. I scoured to try to find information before I took the plunge, and the only thing I could find is one Facebook group, and there were like 1 or 2 guys, I'll link here, who posted about it, and I saw enough photos of theirs that convinced me that it is a sharp lens, and it would be usable. So I was a little nervous when I brought it home, but luckily, you know, everything that I saw there that made me feel confident has panned out and been true. And I think the things that I knew about it going in, the lack of IS and it's big and heavy, I mean, those weren't surprises. So I think I knew about that, and I knew what I was getting into. It gets you thinking about other lenses, right? Like, so you take the 500 f4 and put a 1.4 teleconverter on it, and now you've got a 700 5.6. That's definitely a really interesting option. And if I were starting from scratch and didn't see this for sale, and I saw a used 500 f4 from Sigma, would I go that way? I would definitely think about it. Even now, like it gets me thinking about that in comparison to the Nikon 800 6.3, because you're in a similar weight bracket at that point. I think they're within about a pound's difference. But the Sigma is still heavy. It's still 7 pounds or something, so it's still like not something you're probably going to handhold all day long. So for me, I said, well, 500 millimeters is not usually enough reach for the kind of stuff I shoot. So if I don't want to handhold it and I'm going to have a teleconverter on all the time, I'd rather shoot this at 800 5.6 than shoot 700 5.6 that has to have a teleconverter on. Even if you're not losing much, you're losing a little bit. The 500 f4 would definitely focus faster, from what I can tell. But when I say I'll do an EVF capture of this at some point when the weather's like not so cold that I don't want to haul everything out. But it certainly focuses fast enough to use. I don't have any, it's not unusable, it's definitely slower. I wouldn't be trying to photograph, you know, really critical bird and flight moments or something with it, but I still got way more sharp shots with it than not. So I think being able to open up to 5.6 is really nice at this length. I mean, obviously a 600 f4 is really interesting at that point as well. Sigma doesn't make one of those though, and when you start getting into the old 600 f4s, it's still something worth checking out, but I think you're going to lose a lot of things if you start going like too much older than this. I think when you're buying an old lens, a couple things you want to keep in mind. Can it be serviced? This still can be. If something went wrong with this, I could send this to Sigma and they would work on it. Who knows how long that will be the policy, but that's really awesome. You don't want to get something that's so old that no one will work on it in case it has an issue or needs to be cleaned. Obviously, you've got to check for the normal stuff, the quality of the glass, haze, fungus, mold, all that kind of stuff, because you don't want to be buying a lemon. And then you also want to make sure that it will autofocus with your camera. So these are lenses that you're either going to want to do a lot of research about if you're buying it online, or if you're buying it in person, bring your stuff and test it. One thing that's kind of annoying with this is I have the Sigma 1.4 teleconverter, I have the new one, and I wanted to put it on this and see, could I put a 1.4 on and get this thing up over, you know, whatever, 1200 millimeters at f8. Would have been super cool. That didn't work. It physically fits, but it won't register, and Sigma got back to me when I talked to them, and they said that it works with the old APO teleconverters, but it doesn't autofocus with them at all. And I don't know why. I still want to test it, but I don't own one. I'm not going to buy one. If I ever meet someone who has one, then I'll slap it on and just see if it works. It is something that I can't say I'll never try, because for a lot of video, like I'd be curious to put the old 2X teleconverter on this for 1600 millimeters manual focus for video. Obviously, you're going to lose a lot of sharpness, but if you're trying to get a shot and you're in the field and your subject's super far away, I think I would rather shoot this with the 2X than crop my video from 4K. You know, 100% in and lose all that resolution. I expect you'd get a better result there. And again, that's only going to work on something you manual focus, but a lot of times in video, you're manually focusing anyway. So it's been a little while since we made one of these gear videos, and I don't want to ramble on too much longer, but I think this is a big difference maker for me, these kind of lenses. And I think if you've never considered it, then I think you really should take a look if you're shooting Nikon or Canon specifically. Because if you've got the budget to go spend $20,000 on a lens, power to you. I'm not saying this is better than the new lens. I'm saying most people who are into the hobby don't have the money to spend that on the lens. And I think having these as an option is really cool. So again, whether that's the old, in the past I shot the Nikon 300 2.8 VR2, super cool lens. You can get those for, $3,000 if you're Canadian, if you're lucky. So I think if you're looking at switching brands and you're thinking about what's out there, you shouldn't just automatically default that you're going to go buy the Canon 100 to 500 or, Nikon has their event this weekend, so maybe they'll announce the new 200 to 600. But you shouldn't assume that a prime is out of the question. If you're thinking about it and you're willing to go to an older prime, it might be an option. Now, again, it depends what you're after. If you want lightweight, mobility, sharpness, and autofocus speed, then yeah, one of these new zooms, the quality is super awesome. And when you list all that stuff, that sounds really great, and that's probably the option for a lot of people. But there is a look you get from a super fast lens that enables you to shoot that extra little bit in low light, and I've made videos on this before. You can always raise your ISO and edit the photo and slow down your shutter. It gives you options. But having another option with a fast lens, it just takes things a bit further. And when you get a fast lens on a full frame sensor, it just gives you a little bit more flexibility with that aesthetic as well. So it's maybe not something that's worth spending 20 grand to you for, but if you can go find an old lens for 2,000 or 3,000 and the zoom costs 2,000 or 3,000, suddenly you might be interested in looking at something like this. Now, I will say too, while this is, I'm with Nikon, I think forever here at this point. It's got everything that I want on this system. Save for one thing, and I think that's the coolest lens on the market right now, is the RF 100 to 400 from Canon. And I joke with friends, and I always belittle this cheap little plastic lens that could. But for a lens that sells for like $800 Canadian brand new, it's very, very sharp, and it's like this big. It would fit in the lens hood of this thing almost. Actually, it literally might fit in the hood, and it weighs nothing. So if you're shooting Canon and you go buy something like this, and then you know that you can still spend $800 and get a tack sharp, very usable, great stabilized little lens, that's a big win. That's something that I'm curious about right now. I would love a lightweight 1 to 400, but there just really aren't any options. I don't have the budget or the need to buy the Z 100 to 400, even though I'm sure it's a great lens. Tamron and Sigma both make 100 to 400s, but they've both got their quirks. They're not super sharp. They're not really light. They're both, I think, 3 pounds, and they're 6.3, so they're not as fast. So Nikon doesn't have an equivalent to that 1 to 400 f8, which is just a super cool little lens that would complement a big beast like this. So let me know in the comments below if you're shooting any weird glass. I think like the Nikon 500 5.6 is something I really want to try just because it's light, it's current, it's fast, it's got a lot of perks. So that's definitely a lens that, and a few Fuji shooters have told me they were adapting that to Fuji. So that seems like a lens that a lot of people have an affinity for. But yeah, I would love to know what kind of like weird old glass that you're shooting. I saw someone locally selling a Nikon 500 f4 that doesn't autofocus, manual focus only, for super cheap. That's probably not something that would ever make sense for most people, including myself. But yeah, there's a lot of cool stuff out there, like Generation 1 EF Canon glass. Even some of the Mark II Canon stuff you can get cheap. But some of these old Sigma lenses are really cool, especially if you get something that's 10 to 15 years old. I think there's some really cool stuff out there. So yeah, hope this was educational, and I'm going to have as many samples of this as I can. I'll try to do more in the future. So if you're interested, if you're on the fence and you found this video because you're curious about it, I would say if the lens is in good shape and it's something that you're thinking about testing out, hopefully this gives you a vote of confidence that it's worth at least checking. And yeah, if we need more samples, let me know and I'll try to provide them. So thanks for watching. Breaking a bunch of rules. I'm trying to get used to filming on the Z9, and I'm testing way too many new pieces of gear. So I'll pop in a little picture here. of the kit, but we're using just a little monitor, a FeelWorld LUT 6 that I've had kicking around since my Canon days. And that's because the Z9 screen doesn't flip out. I'm finding I really like the screen in the field. It's sturdy. I don't feel like I'm going to break it off like I used to with some of the flippy screens, but it's certainly a pain for vlogging. And I'm using this like thin Manfrotto tripod, and I gotta say the Z9 looks pretty precarious with this big lens and a monitor perched up on this thing. What else are we doing that's new? I decided not to shoot against a window. I wanted to buy a new studio light to try to overpower the daylight in this office here, but too much photography gear came through instead, so there's no money left for lights. So instead, we're gonna kind of make use of daylight, see what we can do here. I'm trying new mic systems, so hopefully this video doesn't get thrown in the garbage for bad audio. This is the Hollyland M1 wireless kit, and I bought this mainly for when I'm vlogging in the field on the iPhone, so you don't have to keep listening to wind noise and stuff like that. So we're trying some new things, and we're gonna see where we can go. I tried this with a matte box and some heavy ND filters to block out the light. I was originally shooting against the window like I've done before, but the trouble is my studio lights weren't bright enough to actually block out the sun from behind, so I was just left with a super weird image that would not autofocus. And lens choice, so the Sigma 135 1.8, so the camera is way on the other side of the room. It's okay. Usually I would use something wider. I also picked up the Sigma